We are lying as if on a salver, in full view and range, of the 4th Canadian and 1st Polish Division's guns. Those words were not spoken by a frightened young conscript hiding in a ditch. They were written by a brigadier general of the Waffen-SS, a man who had fought beside the founding ranks of Hitler's bodyguard, who had won the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, who had broken Soviet positions on the steppes of Russia. They were written by Kurt Meyer, the youngest divisional commander in the German army of 1944, and the man whose 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth had cut the North Nova Scotia Highlanders to pieces on the road to Caen. In a single sentence from his own memoir, Meyer named the men who had finally cornered him, the men whose artillery had walked across his command column like the hand of fate, the men whose tanks had blocked every road out of the trap. They were Canadians and Poles. By the time the smoke cleared in late August of 1944, the man known to Berlin as Panzer Meyer was no longer a panzer commander. He was a fugitive on foot, his head bandaged, his division reduced from 20,540 men to a few hundred, and his future a Canadian courtroom. This is the story of what Kurt Meyer said about those Canadians, not what propaganda said, not what later mythology said, what he wrote, what he testified to, and what he muttered in the dock at Aurich in December of 1945. It is also the story of what the Canadians said back, in the language they spoke best, the language of the 17-pounder gun, the bayonet, and the burning Sherman tank. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the strange place Meyer occupied in the war. By June of 1944, the German army recognized 3 categories of Western Allied opponents. The Americans were feared for their weight of metal, the relentless flood of fuel and shells and aircraft that no continental army could match. The British were respected as veterans, scarred and methodical, hardened by 5 years of total war. The Canadians, in the German files, were something stranger. They were a small army from a country most German staff officers could not find on a map. They fielded only 5 infantry divisions and 2 armoured brigades in the European theatre. And yet again and again in the assessments captured from Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS formations, the same words appear beside their name. Stubborn, aggressive, unyielding. The kind of men who closed with the bayonet when their tanks burned. The kind of men who did not stop coming. Kurt Meyer met those Canadians at the worst possible moment for them and for him. The questions this video will answer are simple. Who exactly were the Canadians who almost killed him at Falaise? What did Meyer say about them in his own words, before, during, and after the battle? And why, in the end, did the Canadians choose to put him on trial rather than against a wall? To find the answers, we have to walk through 3 places. The medieval stone of an abbey near Caen, where 20 Canadian prisoners of war were executed at his headquarters. The choking dust of the road from Caen to Falaise, where his teenage division was ground to powder by Canadian artillery. And the courtroom at Aurich in northern Germany, where a Canadian lieutenant colonel stood up and said the words that would seal Meyer's fate. But before any of that, we have to strip away a myth. The myth is that Kurt Meyer was a brilliant, almost mystical battlefield commander, a young eagle of the SS, a man whose divisions only failed because they were outnumbered. The reality, written into the war diaries of the Canadian regiments who fought him and into the post-war studies of Canadian and German historians alike, is more complicated. Meyer was personally brave to the point of recklessness. He was popular with his teenage soldiers because he led from the front in an open Kubelwagen with a cigar clamped in his teeth. He understood reconnaissance, surprise, and the value of speed. But he was also impulsive, theatrical, and operationally limited. His division would attack and attack and attack against Canadian positions in the first weeks of the Normandy campaign, and almost every one of those attacks would fail. By the end of June, the 12th SS had lost more than half its strength. The Canadians had bent. They had not broken. So, how did Kurt Meyer end up in this position? The answer lies in his origin, and in the origin of the men he led. Meyer was born on December 23, 1910, in the village of Jerxheim, in what was then the Duchy of Brunswick, today the German state of Lower Saxony. His father had been a factory worker before 1914, and rose to the rank of sergeant in the Imperial Army. The young Kurt apprenticed as a shopkeeper, worked road construction, and delivered the mail before joining the Mecklenburg State Police in October of 1929. He joined the Nazi Party in 1930, and the SS in 1931, transferring into the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler in May of 1934, when that unit was still Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment. The nickname Panzer Meyer is sometimes traced to a fall from a roof at the police academy that left him with multiple fractures and a reputation for being as tough as a tank. Whether that origin is true or embroidered, the name stuck. By 1944, he was 33 years old, a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, and a hardened veteran of the campaigns in Poland, France, Greece, and the Soviet Union. He had taken a reconnaissance battalion across the Klissura Pass in Greece on April 13, 1941, cutting off the German line of advance and forcing the surrender of Kastoria. That action made him the 291st recipient of the Knight's Cross. He had fought in the great battles of 1941, 1942, and 1943 on the Eastern Front, including the brutal house-to-house combat at Kharkov in February of 1943, and an attack on a village called Yefremovka that won him the oak leaves. During the same operation, the civilian population of Yefremovka was shot, and the village burnt to the ground by the reconnaissance battalion under his command, a fact that the post-war interrogations of his subordinates would describe in chilling detail. By the time he took command of the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the new 12th SS Division in the summer of 1943, he was already a man whose sense of war had been formed on a front where prisoners were often a temporary inconvenience. The 12th SS Hitler Youth Division was, even by the standards of the Waffen-SS, an unusual formation. It was raised in the autumn of 1943 from 16,000 boys born in 1926, the youngest cohort then eligible for service. Most were 16 and 17 years old when they entered training at Beverloo in occupied Belgium. They were officered and shaped by a hard core of Eastern Front veterans transferred from the Leibstandarte. By the time they landed in Normandy, they numbered just over 20,500 men with more than 180 gun tanks, including roughly 81 Panthers and 104 Panzer IVs. Their average junior soldier was 18 years old. Only 3% of the rank and file were over the age of 25, and almost all of those were officers and senior non-commissioned officers. Because so many of the boys were under the legal age for tobacco and alcohol, the division was issued boiled sweets and chocolate in place of the standard cigarette and schnapps rations. They were children fighting under a black runic emblem, led by a man with a cigar in his teeth. When the Allies came ashore on June 6, 1944, the 12th SS was held in reserve south of Caen. Meyer's regiment moved on the morning of June 7 to plug the gap that the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had punched through at Juno Beach. Meyer chose for his command post the high ground of the Abbaye de Ardennes, a 12th-century Premonstratensian monastery whose stone towers overlooked the open wheat fields north and west of Caen. From those towers he saw, mid-morning on June 7th, a column of Canadian infantry riding on Sherman tanks, advancing through the village of Aurich toward the airfield at Carpiquet. Those Canadians were the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the 27th Canadian Armoured Regiment, the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. They were, in Meyer's own words, showing him their unprotected flank. In his memoir, he described the moment with a startling directness. "My God, what an opportunity," he wrote. "The tanks are driving right across 2nd Battalion's front. The unit is showing us its unprotected flank." He gave the order to hold fire until his battalions were ready to spring the trap. Then, on his command, the wheat fields erupted. Panzer IV tanks from Karl-Heinz Prinz's battalion and Panzer Grenadiers from Hans Scapini's 2nd Battalion of the 25th Regiment slammed into the Canadian column from concealed positions. 88mm anti-tank guns shredded the Sherbrooke's tanks at ranges where the Canadian 75mm guns could not reply. By the end of that afternoon, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders had suffered roughly 370 casualties, including 84 killed and 128 taken prisoner. The Sherbrooke Fusiliers lost dozens more men and a long column of tanks burning on the road through Aurich. Scapini was wounded in the same fighting and died of his wounds soon after. It was a tactical victory for Meyer. It was also, in the German files, the moment a particular and very specific Canadian rage was born, because what happened next at the Abbaye des Ardennes would change the character of the entire campaign. Over the evening of June 7 and the days that followed, 20 Canadian prisoners of war, 11 from the North Novas and the Sherbrooks on the 7th, 7 more on the 8th, and 2 more on the 17th, were executed inside the walls of Meyer's headquarters. They were taken one by one from a passageway near the stables, walked into a small garden behind the chapel, and shot or beaten to death. A Canadian Army pathologist who later examined 18 of the bodies confirmed every single victim died from a head wound. 8 had been shot. The rest had been killed with what the report called a blunt instrument. Among the witnesses was a Polish conscript pressed into the SS, Private Jan Jesionek. He would later testify under oath that on the morning of June 8, when a guard reported that 7 Canadian prisoners had been brought in, Meyer said in front of the assembled headquarters staff a single short sentence. "What should we do with these prisoners? They only eat up our rations." And then, loudly enough for everyone in the courtyard to hear, Meyer announced a standing order. In future, no more prisoners are to be taken. Within minutes, the 7 Canadians were led one at a time into the garden. Jesionek heard a single shot for each of them. Afterward, the German soldiers stood in a semicircle and looked at the bodies. That, more than anything else, is what Kurt Meyer said about the Canadians on the day his trap was sprung. He said, "They ate his rations." The killings at the Abbaye d'Ardenne were not isolated. In the same week, men of the 12th SS murdered 19 more Canadians at the Château d'Ordrieu, where the Divisional Reconnaissance Battalion had its headquarters. 41 more were killed in and around Les Hauts du Bosc and Fontenay-le-Pesnel. The total number of Canadian prisoners executed by the 12th SS in the first weeks of June 1944 was set by the historian Howard Margolian at 156. Word spread through the Canadian regiments at the speed of rumour and rage. By the second week of June, in the war diaries of the North Novas, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Reginas, and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, an unwritten understanding hardened. There would be no more friendly conversations with 12th SS prisoners on the road back. There would be no second chances for boys in camouflage smocks who tried to surrender after firing their last belt of machine gun ammunition. The Canadians had received Meyer's message. They were now writing their reply. That reply began in the rolling fields between Bretteville-les-Orgueilleux and Norry on the night of June 8–9. Meyer launched a second attack with Panther tanks and his best Panzer grenadiers, intending to break through to the sea. The Regina rifles held him off in close quarters, fighting with anti-tank guns. A Saskatchewan rifleman named Joe Lapointe knocked out a Panther almost on top of Lieutenant Colonel Foster Matheson's command post with a PIAT weapon. Several senior officers of the 12th SS Panzer Regiment, including the commander Max Wuncher, were killed or wounded. Meyer's own vehicle was disabled. By morning, in the streets of Bretteville and in the wheat fields outside Norry, the Canadian gunners had left a long row of Panthers smoking. The elite of the Waffen-SS had been bloodied and stopped by a Saskatchewan rifle battalion in the heart of Normandy. It would not be the last time. In the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated itself. At Puteaux-en-Bessin, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, known to the army as the Little Black Devils, bent under a 12th SS assault and counterattacked the same evening. They lost 256 men, including roughly 150 taken prisoner. At Carpiquet Airfield in early July, the North Shore Regiment and the Royal Winnipeg Rifles took the village under unimaginable shell fire and the kind of fanatical defense that only teenage boys raised on the Hitler Youth marching songs could mount. The North Shore lost 132 men in a single day, 46 of them killed. A North Shore soldier wrote afterward that he had never realized how far discipline, pride of unit, and pride in oneself and one's family could carry a man when each step forward meant possible death. He was speaking for thousands. The bloodiest day of the entire campaign for the Canadians came on July 25 in Operation Spring. Lieutenant General Guy Simons, commanding the 2nd Canadian Corps, threw 4 Canadian battalions against the dug-in SS divisions on Verrières Ridge south of Caen. The Black Watch of Canada, advancing up the bare slope toward the village of Fontenay-le-Marmion, was almost annihilated. Of the men who went forward that morning, 307 were killed, wounded, or captured. The acting commanding officer, Major Phil Griffin, was killed, leading his men. A captured German order written for the troops on the southern slope read simply, "If you cross the ridge, you are a dead man." The Canadians lost roughly 1,500 men in 24 hours. Operation Spring failed, but the bleeding was not in vain. The SS divisions facing the Canadians stayed pinned to that ridge, while 200 kilometers to the west, the Americans of First Army broke through the German line at St. Lo and tore open the front. Operation Cobra succeeded in part because the Canadians had refused to stop dying on Verrières Ridge. By August of 1944, the German army in Normandy was dying. The British and Canadians had ground down the panzer divisions east of Caen. The Americans had broken loose in the west and were swinging south and east in a great encircling movement. If the Canadians and the Polish forces under Major General Stanislaw Maciek, attached to 1st Canadian Army, could push south from Caen to Falaise, the entire German 7th Army could be trapped in a vast pocket. The man chosen to design that thrust was Guy Simonds. The plan he produced was unlike anything the Allies had attempted in Normandy. It was called Operation Totalize. Simonds did three things no commander on the Western Front had done before. He attacked at night with massed armour. He had his engineers strip the gun barrels out of 76 surplus self-propelled artillery pieces and turn them into field improvised armoured personnel carriers, soon nicknamed kangaroos. They were the first dedicated tracked carriers used in operational service. And he choreographed the advance with bomber support. Searchlights bounced off cloud to make artificial moonlight, radio beacons, tracer streams from anti-aircraft guns, and a rolling artillery barrage of stunning complexity. At 11 on the night of August 7, 6 columns of armour and infantry in kangaroos drove south from the Caen plain into the German lines. By dawn on August 8, they had cracked the first defensive belt. The Canadian infantry brigades that rode in kangaroos suffered a fraction of the casualties of those who walked. It was a tactical breakthrough on a scale the Canadians had not yet achieved in Normandy. Kurt Meyer, now commanding the wreckage of the 12th SS after the death of his predecessor Fritz Witt to a Royal Navy shell on June 14, drove forward in his Kübelwagen to find the breakthrough. He met it on the Caen to Falaise road. Streaming past him in the morning light came the panic-stricken survivors of the German 89th Infantry Division, an inexperienced static formation that had taken the brunt of Simonds' bombers. Meyer described the moment in his memoir with the same theatrical confidence he had used at Aurich. He stopped his car. He lit a cigar. He stood in the middle of the road. And in a loud voice he asked the fleeing soldiers if they were going to leave him alone to cope with the enemy. They stopped. They hesitated. And then they went back to their positions, because there was nowhere else to go. It is the most famous scene in Meyer's memoir, repeated in 100 post-war books. It is also the moment his luck began to run out. Because the Canadian artillery and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, and a British Sherman Firefly gunner named Joe Ekins of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry were waiting for him just up the road, in the ambush position around the village of St. Agnan de Cramsnil. There, between 12:30 and 10 minutes to 1 on the afternoon of August 8, Tiger Tank 007, commanded by SS Captain Michael Wittmann, the most famous Panzer ace of the German army, was destroyed in a fire so fierce it blew the turret clear of the hull. The kill is contested between Ekins' Firefly and Major Sidney Radley Walters, a squadron of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, firing from cover at the wall of the chateau at Gaumsnil. Both claims are credible. The Canadian historian Brian Reed argues persuasively that the Sherbrooks finished Wittmann at point-blank range. Whichever crew loaded the round that ended the legend, the lesson was clear. The kingdom of the Tiger had ended on a Canadian battlefield. The next day, August 9th, brought the Canadians their own catastrophe. A reinforced regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Donald Worthington, drawn from the British Columbia Regiment and the Algonquin Regiment of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, set off in the pre-dawn darkness to seize Hill 195. Choked by dust, blinded by smoke, navigating with torn maps, they took a wrong turn. By first light they had not reached Hill 195. They were 6.5 kilometres off course on a different rise of ground, deep inside Meyer's defensive zone. From the morning of August 9, the Panzers and 88s of Battle Group Waldmüller, supported by Tigers from the Heavy SS Tank Battalion 101, methodically destroyed Worthington Force in a field roughly 300 metres by 150 metres. Worthington was killed by a mortar round. The British Columbia Regiment suffered roughly 133 casualties on or because of that hilltop. 47 of 52 Shermans were destroyed. The Algonquins lost more than 100 men. In the harder ledger that staff officers keep, Worthington Force suffered around 240 casualties in total, 85 killed, 121 wounded, and 34 captured. It was a tactical disaster. It was also a successful blocking action by men who refused to surrender, even when surrounded by the most feared armour in the German army. The Canadian advance toward Falaise stalled briefly. On August 14, Simons launched a second set-piece, Operation Tractable. Behind a smokescreen of yellow target indicator, his armour and infantry pushed across the Laison River. Then disaster struck a second time. Of 811 aircraft from Royal Air Force Bomber Command dispatched against the German positions, 77 bombed short. 44 of those 77 were from No. 6 Group of the Royal Canadian Air Force. They mistook the yellow smoke being used by the Canadian ground troops as their air recognition signal for the yellow target indicator marking the German lines. They bombed their own men. More than 150 Canadians and Poles were killed and 241 wounded. The same kind of error had killed Canadian troops on August 8 under American bombs. The lesson, twice paid for in blood, was finally absorbed. But the advance did not stop. On August 16 and 17, the 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade of Major General Charles Foulkes, 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, entered Falaise. The last 12th SS rearguard, around 60 boys, under an SS officer named Kraus, fought from the ruins of the City Girls' School until the building burned around them. Only 3 or 4 were taken alive. The rest preferred to die. By August 18, Trun had fallen to the Lincoln and Welland Regiment, the Lake Superior Regiment, and the Canadian Grenadier Guards. The pocket was closing. The geography of the next 4 days is the heart of this story. The German 7th Army and remnants of the 5th Panzer Army were now compressed into a corridor about 10 kilometres long and 6 kilometres wide, running roughly from Trun in the north through St. Lambert-sur-Dives in the centre to Chambois in the south, with the heights of Mont-Ormel rising to the east. Through this corridor flowed 2 streams of escape. The bridge at St. Lambert, the Moisy ford 2 kilometres downstream. Both ran across the Dives River. Both were the only way out for tens of thousands of German soldiers, the rolling stock of an army group, and the broken divisions of the Waffen-SS. Including, that week, what was left of the 12th SS Hitler Youth. Kurt Meyer was inside the pocket. His division, which had landed in Normandy with 20,540 men, was now reduced to a few hundred soldiers and a handful of operational tanks. The German High Command Army Group B reported on August 22 that the 12th SS consisted of 300 men, 10 tanks, and no artillery. Meyer's account of the breakout, written in his memoir, is the most quoted German description of the Falaise pocket ever printed. "The misery around us screams to high heaven," he wrote. "Refugees and soldiers from the broken German armies look helplessly at the bombers flying continuously overhead. It is useless to take cover from the bursting shells and bombs. Concentrated in such a confined space, we offer unique targets for the enemy air power. The forest areas are full of wounded soldiers and the sundered bodies of horses. Death shadows us at every step. We are lying, as if on a salver in full view and range of the 4th Canadian and 1st Polish Division's guns." That sentence is the answer to the question that titles this video. By his own pen, Meyer named the men who almost killed him. They were the gunners and tankers and infantrymen of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division. They were the Polish 1st Armoured Division of Stanislaw Maciek, fighting under 1st Canadian Army. And they were the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division on the northern shoulder of the pocket, the same division whose North Novas and Sherbrooks had been murdered at his headquarters 11 weeks earlier. The circle had closed. The Canadians who made the trap mortal were concentrated at one place above all others, St. Lambert-sur-Dives. There, on the afternoon of August 18, a 32-year-old militia officer named Major David Vivian Curry of the South Alberta Regiment was given a job that the regimental history would later describe as impossible. With C Squadron of the South Alberta Regiment and around 55 men of B Company of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada under Major Ivan Martin, Curry was ordered to take and hold the bridge at St. Lambert and the village around it. He was to do this against the entire fleeing weight of the German 7th Army. He went forward on foot through the German outposts to recover 2 Shermans that had been knocked out by 88s at last light on August 18. He brought back the surviving crews under heavy mortar fire. The next morning, August 19, without preliminary artillery, he attacked at dawn with the Argyll's bayonets fixed and his tanks rolling behind. By midday, they had taken the bridge and the northern half of the village. A Canadian Army cameraman, Lieutenant Donald Grant, took a photograph of Curry that morning, pistol in hand, calmly supervising the surrender of a German officer riding in a Kubelwagen and a half-track full of his men. Another cameraman, Sergeant Jack Stollery, filmed the same scene for Canadian Army newsreel number 40. The result is the only known footage of a Victoria Cross action being won. The Canadian official historian, Charles Stacey, later wrote that this is as close as we are ever likely to come to a photograph of a man winning the Victoria Cross. Curry held the village for 36 hours against repeated breakout attempts. Major Martin was killed by mortar shrapnel. Every officer in Curry's command was eventually killed or wounded. Curry himself slept for 1 hour in 3 days. When asked about it afterward, he said he remembered thinking at the time that it was the toughest job the regiment had ever been given. Of his soldiers, he said only that the boys fought very well throughout the whole show. A non-commissioned officer of his squadron later told the citation officers that they had known at one stage that it was going to be a fight to a finish, but Curry was so cool about it that it was impossible for any of them to get excited. By the time he was relieved on the evening of August 21, his official Victoria Cross citation in the London Gazette credited Curry's force with destroying 7 enemy tanks, 12 88mm guns, and 40 other vehicles, killing 300 Germans, wounding 500, and taking 2,100 prisoners. It was the only Victoria Cross awarded to a Canadian during the entire Normandy campaign, and the only Canadian Armoured Corps Victoria Cross of the entire war. 2 kilometres downstream from St. Lambert, the Moisey Ford remained open. Through it, in the darkness of the nights of August 19 and 20, slipped the last fragments of the German army. Among them, on foot, his head bandaged from a shrapnel wound he had taken on the northern shoulder of the pocket, was Kurt Meyer. He had judged the Canadian block at St. Lambert too strong to force. He chose the ford instead, but the ford was not safe either. East of the village rose a 4-kilometre wooded ridge that the Polish General Maciek, looking at his contour map, called the Machuga, the Mace. The Allies called it Hill 262. Its northern summit overlooked the Chambois to Vimoutiers Road, the principal eastern escape route from the pocket. On August 19, 2 Polish battle groups from the 1st Polish Armoured Division reached that summit. They had around 80 Sherman and Cromwell tanks across the 2 battle groups, 20 anti-tank guns, and around 1,500 infantrymen of the Podhalen Highland Rifles and the 8th and 9th Battalions. By nightfall, they were astride the German escape route. By the next morning, they were cut off, surrounded by retreating Germans inside the pocket, and SS Panzer Corps, 2 attacking from the east to relieve them. For 3 days, the Poles fought on the Mace. They held the heights against repeated assaults. The Highland Rifles at one point fought with bayonets, only after their ammunition ran out. The German divisions trying to break out around them, including the 2nd SS Das Reich, the 9th SS Hohenstaufen, the 1st SS Leibstandart, the 10th SS Frundsberg, and Meyer's own 12th SS, hammered them with everything they had. The artillery support for the Poles came from 58 Battery of the 4th Medium Regiment of the Royal Canadian Artillery. The forward observation officer on the ridge was a Canadian, Captain Pierre Sévigné, promoted to major during the battle, who directed Canadian guns onto German columns moving below him. For his service, Sévigné was later awarded the Polish Virtuti Militari, the highest decoration in the Polish military. By the time the Canadian Grenadier Guards relieved the Poles on the afternoon of August 21, the 1st Polish Armoured Division had paid more than 1,400 casualties for the operation. Around them, the Germans had left thousands of dead and thousands of prisoners. The Canadian engineers later put up a sign on the ridge that said simply, "A Polish battlefield." This was the country through which Kurt Meyer fled on foot, a pocket bombarded continuously by the guns of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division and the 1st Polish Armoured Division, the very units he named in his memoir. A floor strewn with the corpses of horses and men, a Canadian artillery officer on a ridge to the east directing fire, a Canadian armoured squadron blocking the bridge to the north. There was no army left for Meyer to command. There were only small groups of survivors and local civilians who knew paths through the hedgerows. He emerged east of Coudeharde around August 21 with around 200 men. By then the High Command had assumed he was dead. On August 27, while Meyer was still wandering in civilian clothes through the French countryside, Hitler awarded him the swords to the Knight's Cross, making him the 91st recipient. The award was made retroactively to a man presumed killed. Meyer received the medal weeks later, in another country, while he was still trying to escape capture. That capture came on September 6 in Belgium, in the Yvetot commune of the province of Namur. Meyer's last command post had been at Durnal. By the morning of September 6, he had moved a few kilometers to a farm in the village of Spontin, where the local man Alexandre Lamy was sheltering him. Advance elements of the U.S. First Army had broken into the area that afternoon. A villager named Calixte Tassio saw two Germans hiding in a chicken coop and ran to the Belgian gendarme Hector Hock. There was a brief gunfight in the parish cemetery in Spontin, with Meyer firing pistol rounds from cover among the gravestones at gendarmes André Tillemont and Victor Demazy. He was wounded. His driver, a senior non-commissioned officer named Bornhoft, was wounded in the thigh during the chase, taken to the Spontin gendarmerie, and died later in custody. An American officer arriving on the scene almost certainly saved Meyer's life. The man who had stood on the Caen to Falaise road 3 weeks earlier with a cigar in his mouth was now a prisoner in a borrowed Wehrmacht tunic, pretending to be an army colonel. His SS identity was discovered on November 18, after a German prisoner he had once dismissed from officer training denounced him. It was confirmed by his SS blood group tattoo. He was held first at Compiègne, then at the British Interrogation Centre at Trent Park outside London. In late August of 1945, 3 months after the war in Europe ended, Canadian intelligence officers conducted a special interrogation of him at the headquarters of the Canadian forces in the Netherlands. Their assessment of the prisoner is itself a key piece of evidence. The Canadian editor of the report later wrote that Meyer demonstrated a remarkable memory, which proved less forthcoming on certain matters during his subsequent war crimes trial. The interrogator added that Meyer's mind was crystal clear on military matters. It was the kind of grudging, professional respect that one soldier gives another. It was also the moment Canada decided what to do with him. What Canada decided was to put him on trial. The first trial under Canadian military law for a foreign war criminal opened in Aurich, in northern Germany, on December 10, 1945. The court president was Major General Harry Foster, who had commanded the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade on D-Day and the 4th Canadian Armoured Division in the closing of the Falaise pocket. The other 4 members of the bench were senior Canadian officers who had fought in northwest Europe. The judge advocate was Lieutenant Colonel Bredin. The defending officer was Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Andrew. The prosecutor was Lieutenant Colonel Bruce MacDonald, a militia lawyer from Windsor, Ontario, who had commanded the Essex Scottish Regiment at Verrières Ridge in late July. He had been relieved of command in the days after that battle and reassigned as the head of the Canadian War Crimes Investigation Unit. He had spent more than a year putting the case together. The 5 charges were serious and specific: that Meyer had incited and counselled his troops to deny quarter to Allied troops; that he was responsible for the killing of 23 Canadian prisoners of war at or near Buron and Orthy; that he had given orders to kill 7 Canadian prisoners of war at the Abbaye des Ardennes; that, alternatively, he was responsible for those killings as the commanding officer, and that he was responsible for the killing of 11 other Canadian prisoners of war at his headquarters. Meyer pleaded not guilty to all 5 charges. The prosecution's central witness was Jan Jesionek. He testified about Meyer's question regarding what to do with the prisoners who only ate German rations. He testified about the order: in future no more prisoners are to be taken. He testified about hearing each individual shot from the passageway as the 7 Canadians were taken into the garden one at a time. 4 other former soldiers of the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment testified that Meyer had said, in a speech at Beverloo, that his regiment took no prisoners. The defence argued the words had been milder, more along the lines of a soldier's exhortation that none of his men should allow themselves to be captured alive. The court was unconvinced. On the stand, Meyer denied everything material. He denied giving orders to shoot prisoners. He denied knowing on June 7 that any Canadian had been killed at his headquarters. He claimed he first found out about the bodies in the garden on the morning of June 10, when 2 officers reported them to him, and that he had been incensed when he saw the truth. The prosecution then called a French boy named Daniel Lachèvre, who lived near the Abbey and had played in its garden on the evenings of June 8, 9, and 10. He testified that in those evenings he had seen nothing unusual: no bodies, no graves, no disturbed earth. The case turned, in the end, on the doctrine that a commander is responsible for the conduct of his men. Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald rose to deliver his closing address. He told the court that the prosecution could not produce a photograph of the accused standing over dead bodies with a smoking pistol in his hand. He admitted that no such photograph existed and that no live witness had seen Meyer pull the trigger. Then he said, "But we are doing something better than that. We have brought before you the officer in whose mind was hatched these crimes to be executed by others. He is the greater menace. He is the one in such a case to be held responsible, and above all others, to be punished." On December 28, 1945, the court found Meyer guilty of inciting his troops to deny quarter, of being responsible for the deaths of 7 Canadians on June 8 by the doctrine of command responsibility, and of being responsible for the deaths of 11 other Canadians. He was acquitted of having directly given the orders. He was sentenced to suffer death by being shot. Then Meyer was permitted, by Canadian military law, to make a closing statement. What he said in that statement, more than anything else in his entire wartime career, is the answer to the question that this video has been pursuing. He stood up. He looked at the panel of Canadian generals who had just sentenced him to death, and he said, "By the Canadian Army I was treated as a soldier, and the proceedings were fairly conducted." That is the only verdict on Canada that Meyer ever delivered in public. It is preserved in the official record. The execution was scheduled for early January of 1946. On the 5th of that month, 2 days before the date set, the order was stayed. The man who stayed it was Major General Christopher Vaux, commanding the Canadian Army Occupation Force. Vaux had himself ordered the levelling of the German town of Falaise in April of 1945, in retaliation for the death of a Canadian commanding officer who, it later turned out, had not been killed by civilians at all. Vaux flew to London and met with the Canadian High Commissioner Vincent Massey and the legal advisor John Reed. Together with senior Canadian commanders, they reviewed the case. They concluded, in the words of the formal minute, that the extreme penalty of death would only be justified in a case where the offence was conclusively shown to have resulted either from the direct act of the commander or by his omission to act when he knew that if he did not act a war, crime would be committed. Massey wrote a single line. "I would commute the sentence." Vaux signed the commutation on January 14, 1946. The reason Vaux gave in public for the commutation was procedural. The reason he gave in his memoir, written nearly 40 years later, was something else entirely. "There isn't a general or colonel on the Allied side that I know of," he wrote, "who hasn't said, 'Well, this time we don't want any prisoners.'" Vaux was speaking the truth that historians like Max Hastings and Howard Margolian would later put more bluntly. Allied troops who shot prisoners on the battlefield, often in supposed retaliation, almost never faced charges. The Canadian historian Terry Kopp drew the precise distinction. There was no doubt, he said, that Allied soldiers killed prisoners in the heat of battle. The point of the atrocities by the 12th SS was different. Those were executions that occurred long after the battle was over. At the Abbaye d'Ardennes, the Canadians had been walked into a garden one at a time and shot through the head from behind. There is a difference between what happens in the first minute of a firefight and what happens in a stone garden 3 hours later, and Canadian generals in 1946 knew it. Meyer was transferred to Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick in April of 1946. He remains the only foreign war criminal ever held in a Canadian penitentiary. He worked in the prison library. He learned English. He corresponded with the Canadian officer who had escorted him at Aurich, Major Arthur Russell, and with senior Canadian commanders. The warden at Dorchester, Colonel George Goad, would later write a magazine article describing Meyer as his star prisoner. According to Meyer's family, he found it degrading to be held among ordinary criminals, but he never mistreated his Canadian guards, and they did not mistreat him. In October of 1951, he was transferred to the British military prison at Wörl in occupied Germany. In November of that year, the Globe and Mail discovered that he had been allowed out of Wörl on a day pass, and a parliamentary controversy ensued. He was finally released on September 7, 1954, almost 10 years to the day after his capture in Belgium. Thousands of former Waffen-SS comrades greeted him in Germany. Meyer spent the rest of his life as a beer distributor for a brewery in Hagen, where he sometimes sold beer to Canadian soldiers stationed in West Germany. He became the leading public spokesman for the post-war veterans organization of the Waffen-SS, an outfit known by its initials HIAG. He published his memoir under the title Grenadier in 1956. At a rally in Carlsberg, Bavaria, in front of around 8,000 former SS men, he made the speech that defined his post-war position. SS troops, he said, committed no crimes, except for the massacre at Oradour, and that was the action of a single man. He insisted the Waffen-SS had been as much a regular army outfit as any other in the German armed forces. The historical record contradicts him on every point. His own division alone murdered 156 Canadians in a single week of June 1944, 20 of them in the garden of his own headquarters. He died of a heart attack on his 51st birthday, December 23, 1961, in Hagen, Westphalia. Around 15,000 people attended his funeral, with Sepp Dietrich at the head of the cortege. So far as the public record shows, he never apologized to a Canadian veteran in his life. What then did Kurt Meyer say about the Canadians who almost killed him at Falaise? He said three things, on three different stages, in three different voices. On the road to Caen on June 7th, he saw their tanks crossing his front and called it an opportunity to throw them back into the sea. In the chaos of the pocket on August 20, with shrapnel in his head and his division reduced to a few hundred fugitives, he wrote that he and his men were lying as if on a salver, in full view and range of the 4th Canadian and 1st Polish Division's guns. And in the courtroom at Aurich on December 28, 1945, with 5 Canadian generals about to send him to a firing squad, he said that by the Canadian Army he had been treated as a soldier and that the proceedings against him had been fair. Those 3 sentences, taken together, are the most honest verdict on the Canadian Army of 1944 ever delivered by a Waffen-SS general. It is worth saying clearly, at the end of this account, what the cost was. The Canadian Army suffered 18,444 casualties in Normandy, including 5,021 dead. From the start of Operation Totalize to the closing of the pocket, in just 2 weeks, the 1st Canadian Army lost approximately 5,700 men, including 1,479 killed. The 12th SS, Hitler Youth, which had landed in Normandy in early June with 20,540 men, was, by August 22, a formation of 300 soldiers, 10 tanks, and no artillery. Around 9,000 of its boys, most of them 17 and 18 years old, were dead in 11 weeks. They had been led, fed propaganda, and ultimately spent by men who walked away. Some of those men, like Meyer, walked away into Canadian custody. Most of the boys never walked away at all. The trial at Aurich is now recognized as one of the earliest applications anywhere in the world of the doctrine of command responsibility, the principle that an officer can be held criminally accountable for crimes committed by his subordinates when he knew, or should have known, what they were doing and failed to stop or punish them. The principles MacDonald argued in that small German courthouse would echo forward into the Geneva Conventions, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and Canada's own Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. They are the legal grandchildren of what happened in the garden of the Abbaye des Ardennes. There is one final image worth holding in your mind. On June 6, 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, the Canadian Veterans Affairs Minister W. Bennett Campbell unveiled a permanent stone monument in the garden where the prisoners had been killed. 2 Norman master craftsmen, Leon Garnier and Jean Mesnil, had carved it. The bronze plaque reads simply that on the night of June 7–8, 1944, 18 Canadian soldiers were murdered in this garden while being held there as prisoners of war, and that 2 more died there or nearby on June 17. They are dead but not forgotten. In 2004, photographs of the murdered men were hung on the wall of the abbey behind the stone. The bodies of the identified victims rest at Benny-sur-Mer Canadian War Cemetery, a few kilometers from the beach where the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landed. Kurt Meyer is buried at the Friedhof Dellsten, a hillside cemetery in the Dellsten district of Hagen, Germany. There is no plaque at his grave that mentions the abbey. There is no stone there that names the 20 Canadians who never came home from his headquarters. That naming, that record, that memory was left to be done by the country whose soldiers he murdered and whose generals he stood before in a courtroom in Aurich. And on the road from Caen to Falaise, in fields that are now soft with summer wheat, the names of the murdered Canadians are still being read aloud by a country that did the work and is still doing it.